Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Saturday night. Good vach, Shavua Tov. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house as we start the week with some beautiful learning? Joe in the Inland Empire, Shandora in the Bronx, Bella in Florida, Lionel on the Upper West Side, Belle in Texas, Sharon in New Jersey, and I have to reload the YouTube so that I can see the comments. I don't know why YouTube does that. And Patrice in Utah, Frank in San Pedro, Chaim in Florida, Karen in Northern California. As always, I am in awe of my East Coast people learning well past midnight. We have an incredible opportunity tonight, like we do every day, to delve deeply into concepts of Torah. You know why that's so important? I just heard this, we had a guest speaker tonight by our third meal at Shul, Rabbi Shlomo Wiener, the Rosh Yeshiva, the head of Or Sameach Yeshiva in Jerusalem. And he said something so beautiful. I'm going to sum it up quickly because it took him a little bit longer to say it. But, you know, when we leave this world, right, each of us will be asked upon arriving or petitioning to enter Olam Haba and entering the next world, and we're being judged, and they'll ask us, were you honest in business? Did you make regular times for Torah study? And a few other matters like this. I just remember there were 5 of them. And 4 of them like just make perfect sense. I mean, it's just really about what we would expect, just having a strong moral character. But one of them was, did you delve deeply, right? And try to distinguish one matter from another. In other words, did you engage in deep Torah study like we're doing here? And the reason that's so important, and he told us in a much more longer, more beautiful way, but I want to get into our study. The reason that that's so important is, let's say a doctor isn't medicine, right? He has access to the knowledge of medicine. An engineer, he isn't engineering. He's an expert. He has access to the knowledge of engineering. Not so with the Holy One, blessed be He. God and God's knowledge are one. And so and this is what I was talking about yesterday, right? Why is the system so complicated that we couldn't possibly even understand what God requires from us without delving deeply and having sages to guide us in this deep study of what is God's will for us? Because the only thing that's perfect in this world is God's will. And to understand what God's will is, we are invited by God to delve into the knowledge of God through Torah study. So in other words, this is our opportunity not just to hear from God speaking to us, but to really unite with God, to be one with God, to, by invitation, right, by God's invitation, step inside a kind of more inner place of where God is, of God's being. This is only possible because God invites us in. We can't know God. We can't know the unknowable of God. But what God invites us to know, this is why they'll ask us when we leave this world, you had this opportunity. Now you want to spend eternity close to God? Why didn't you take that opportunity when you were alive and you had this chance? And thank God we're taking this opportunity together. So especially when it's difficult, right? When we're talking about sacrifices that haven't been brought in 2,000 years, and we're understanding why the Torah mandates that a particular kind of sacrifice will make an atonement for a particular type of transgression that's not spelled out in the Torah, and it's not clear, and the logic seems to suggest to go in this way, but there's problems in the logic, and we're going to just parse it, even though it can have no practical significance in our own lives. Unlikely. Maybe Mashiach comes this very minute, And then, Eliyahu, Hanavi, the prophet Elijah, or Mashiach himself, will invite us to the debate about which carbon, which offering atones for which transgression. But more likely we'll just be informed of what it is, and Kohanim will deal with it in Jerusalem. But right now, we are invited to parse these offerings and these transgressions and see what's related to what, so that we can take advantage, so that we can say yes when we get the invitation from God to come into, one of God's inner rooms, as it were. Okay, we picked this up about halfway down, about a third of the way down, page 9a, and with God's help we'll do 2 short pages, 9 and 10, tonight here in Tractate Shevuos, the 26th volume of the Talmud, continuing our discussion of Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 1. The Mishnah taught that for the defiling of the temple or its sacrificial foods, in which one did not have awareness, right? A person was tameh, he had come into contact with some form of ritual impurity, let's say a dead person or a dead creeping thing, and forgot, or didn't realize that he was tameh when he stepped into the temple, when the temple was standing in Jerusalem, or he was a Kohen, and he ate some of the sacrificial foods, not realizing that he was tameh. And we've seen there's a difference between whether he ever knew, or he had awareness in the beginning that he was tameh, then he forgot, he had a lapse of awareness, and then did he have awareness afterward? Did he actually remember? In which case it happened during a lapse of awareness, but he knows he did it. Then he's obligated to bring the sliding scale sin offering. Or if he never realized that he did that, in which case the goats of Yom Kippur and possibly the other festivals like the new moon festivals atone for him, at least suspend punishment until he realizes that he's done this. And if he never realizes, then the goats of Yom Kippur atone for him. Just a little bit, since we keep talking about the goats of Yom Kippur. So remember, there's 2 goats on Yom Kippur. One is sent out into the wilderness, so obviously it doesn't have a blood application on the altar in the Holy Temple. The other is slaughtered there on the Temple Mount, and then its blood has an inner application and an outer application, right? The Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur is going to take some of that blood in with him into the Holy of Holies in the sanctuary, and some of that blood gets sprinkled between the staves of the ark. Some of that blood gets sprinkled on the curtain, on the outside of the curtain that separates between the outer sanctuary and the Holy of Holies. And some of that blood gets mixed with the bull blood, and that also gets applied to the altar, the Mizbeach, right? So there's the inner application and the outer application. Okay, the Mishnah teaches for the defiling of the temple or its sacrificial foods in which one did not have awareness, neither at the beginning nor at the end, the goats brought as sin offerings as part of the additional offerings of the festivals, and the goats brought as sin offerings as part of the additional offerings of the new moons, right? Additional offerings, musaf offerings that are brought. There's the daily offerings, and then there's the additional offerings on festivals and on new moons. New moons means Rosh Chodesh, the beginning of a new month. There are additional offerings. And these offerings also help us atone for some of these transgressions that we don't know about, particularly somebody who's tameh and enters the temple or eats sacrificial foods. This is the statement of Rabbi Yehuda. The Gemara elaborates. Rabbi Yehuda says that Shmuel says, what is the reasoning of Rabbi Yehuda? The verse states with regard to additional offerings of the new moons and 1 goat for a sin offering to the Lord. Numbers 28:15. The final phrase, which literally means a sin to the Lord, alludes to the fact that this goat atones for a sin of which only the Lord is aware, i.e., where there was no awareness either at the beginning or at the end. Right? This person has no idea that he became tameh and that he then entered the temple while tameh, and he never realized afterward, but there's a sacrificial system in place that atones for him. It's good to be a Jew. The Gemara objects, but this phrase is necessary in order to expound it in accordance with the statement of Reish Lakish. As Reish Lakish says, what is different about the goat brought as a sin offering of the new moon that is stated with regard to it, quote, to the Lord, a term not written with regard to other sin offerings. And the Holy One, blessed be he, says, as it were, this goat shall be an atonement for the fact that I diminished the size of the moon. So we have a tradition that there was a conversation during the days of creation, between God, the sun, and the moon, right? So originally the moon was as bright as the sun. And there were two great luminaries to rule in the sky, sort of agents of God. And the moon said, well, I mean, if you're saying that we're going to rule, that's what kings do. But you don't have two kings in one kingdom, right? That's not what kings are, right? There's one king. And so God said, okay, then the sun will be the king. And he diminished the moon and made it smaller. And the moon was very sad and said, well, wait a minute. As you define the word king, as you define the concept of ruling, it was a legitimate question that I asked. Why did you diminish me? And the moon was sad. And then the moon was not placated. Hold on a second. Right? There's the Gemara in Tractate Hulin on page 60b. Tells this story that when God first created the sun and the moon, they were of equal size. And the moon complained that it is improper for two kings to rule together, and therefore one of them should be diminished. And God responded that if so, the moon shall be diminished. And so the moon responded that it is unfair that it should suffer on account of having offered a justified argument. And God placated the moon in various ways, such as having the stars accompany it. But the moon was not mollified until God said that the goat should be an atonement for him, right? Now, what's interesting, him is God, that somehow the goat is an atonement for God, and this placates the moon. What does that mean? Like if you would say, well, no, the goat is sort of here, as an atonement for you, for the moon. But it's not worded that way. Now, we're not going to get too deeply into this. Basically, the understanding of our commentators is, no, what it meant is that God said that, no, the goat will be associated with the moon. That's why there's an extra goat offering on every new moon festival. But there's more to it than that, right? It's a calendar based on the moon. We have the solar calendar of 365 days in the solar year, but the Jewish calendar is based on the moon. Every Jewish month, every Hebrew month begins when the moon renews itself. And in fact, allegorically, the Jewish people are associated with the moon. And we definitely sort of wax and wane. Our fortunes rise and fall. But there's a comfort in knowing that, like the moon, it always comes back. Right? It always comes back. We'll never be destroyed. God won't allow us to be destroyed. We may suffer. We may go through really dark times, but it will come back. Okay. So this goat shall be an atonement for the fact that I diminished the moon. The Gemara resolves the problem. If so, i.e., if the phrase was needed only for that statement, let the verse state only a sin offering for the Lord. For what reason does it state to the Lord? In order to expound it in accordance with that which we have said, that it atones only for a sin that the Lord alone is aware of. So the Gemara asks, but why not say that the whole of the phrase comes exclusively to teach this law, and not to expound it in accordance with Reish Lakish's statement at all? And the Gemara answers, if so, let the verse state a sin offering of the Lord. For what reason does it state to the Lord? You can conclude two conclusions from it. So the Gemara asks, but let the goat atone even for other transgressions that a person never became aware of. Why does Rabbi Yehuda limit the scope of its atonement? Why is it only for this issue of being tamei and entering the temple, or being tamei and eating sacrificial foods? There are other transgressions that we commit that we're not aware of. That's why it's so important to make a heshbon, right? Especially when we're in Elul, the last month of the year, and headed for Rosh Hashanah and the days of awe. But really, at every time, and right now is a particularly propitious time as we're counting Sephira and examining our own attributes as we're headed from Passover to Shevuos, we're definitely trying to make an accounting of the soul, an accounting of our actions in this world. And we should be asking ourselves, are there things that I do that hurt others or hurt me or hurt my relationship with God? Am I falling short in ways I don't even realize? Because let's face it, we're much more tuned in to the faults of others than we are into the faults of ourselves. And it's definitely a lesson that's taught in a bunch of places in our tradition. I think particularly the Baal Shem Tov says it, and a few others. Maybe Nina knows, I bet, and can put in the comments because she's really studied really well in Musar. But the idea that when we identify faults in other people, actually it's faults in ourselves. That it's sort of like our subconscious knows we're doing this wrong and we see it in others, but we should ask ourselves all the time when we see somebody acting in a way that we don't like, right away we should ask, do I do that? Is that something that I do? Is that why I'm picking up on it? Definitely our Musar masters have pointed to that. Okay. Okay, so the Gemara says, so let it atone even for other transgressions that a person never became aware of. Why does Rabbi Yehuda limit the scope of its atonement? The sages of the school of Rabbi Yishmael taught, since this goat of the new moon is brought at a fixed time, and that goat of Yom Kippur is brought at a fixed time, they must atone for similar transgressions. And just as that goat of Yom Kippur atones only for the defiling of the temple or its sacrificial foods, so too this goat of the new moon atones only for the defiling of the temple or its sacrificial foods. And the Gemara says, we found a source teaching that the goats of the new moons atone for the defiling of the temple or its sacrificial foods. From where do we derive that the goats of the festivals also atone for such cases? And if you would say that this can also be derived in accordance with that which the sages of the school of Rabbi Yishmael taught, that the suggestion can be refuted as then that suggestion can be refuted as follows. If you try to derive it through a comparison to the goats of the new moon, the comparison is flawed, as those goats are more frequent than those of the festivals, once a month. And if you try to derive it through a comparison to the goat of Yom Kippur, the comparison is also flawed, as that goat has a more extensive atonement, since it atones for all sins. And if you would say, now we're on page 9b, don't we derive the atonement of the goat of the new moon through a comparison to the goat of Yom Kippur? And we did not refute it by saying that the atonement of the goat of Yom Kippur is more extensive. Well, that is not relevant. There, with regard to the goat of the new moon, the basic fact that it provides atonement is written in the verse, as Rav Yehuda explains above, and the comparison to the goat of Yom Kippur is merely revealing a matter, i.e. it teaches in what way its atonement is limited. But here, with regard to the goats of the festivals, the verse does not mention any details about atonement. So it is valid to say that we do not derive the entire matter from the comparison to the goat of Yom Kippur, as it provides a more extensive atonement. So rather, the atonement of the goats of the festivals is derived, just as Rabbi Hamid, the son of Rabbi Hanina, says, in explanation of the opinion of Rabbi Meir that we will encounter on page 10a. The matter is derived from the fact that with regard to the goat of the festivals, the verses that mention the goat could have simply stated a goat, but instead they state and a goat. So here too, the fact that the verse could simply have said a goat, but instead states and a goat, indicates that the goats of the festivals are juxtaposed with the goat of the new moon, which are mentioned at the beginning of the passage. And it teaches that they all effect a similar atonement. So just as the goats of the new moon atone only for cases in which one did not have awareness, neither at the beginning nor at the end, so too the goats of the festivals atone only for cases in which one did not have awareness, neither at the beginning nor at the end. Now you might ask, well, if they all are atoning for the same thing, why do we need so many of them? Right? Wouldn't it suffice just one of these goats per year and we'd be covered? Why do we need a bunch of them? Well, somebody might commit this transgression after the last one and then tragically pass away before the next one. And he would not have had an atonement at the time of his passing. So having them more frequently is a great service to the people. That's just my take on that. Just want to make sure I read that. So just as the goats of the new moon atone only for cases in which one did not have awareness, neither at the beginning nor at the end, so too the goats of the festivals atone only for cases in which one did not have awareness, neither at the beginning nor at the end. They never knew that they committed this transgression. They never knew that they were tameh. A dilemma was raised before the sages. When Rabbi Yehuda says that the goats of the new moons and the festivals atone for cases in which one did not have awareness, neither at the beginning nor at the end, does this statement apply only to a sin that will never become known, right? For example, where no one was present when the person became tameh, he didn't know he became tameh, so it's impossible that he's ever going to find out. But with regard to a sin that will eventually become known, right? He didn't know, but somebody saw him and eventually will say to him, hey, you know what? I noticed that you were at the cemetery that morning. Or that you walked through the cemetery. It's like, I didn't walk through a cemetery. Oh, yeah, you did. Like, that cemetery's not marked very well. Oh, and then he finds out he did it. And so then he would become liable to bring that sliding scale sin offering. So that's the kind of transgression that has a chance of him finding out. Whereas there's another kind where he could never find out. Okay, so we're going to say that these goats only atone for the kind that can never be found out, but it won't atone for the kind that possibly could be found out, even if they are in practice not found out. Very subtle difference. It is considered, right? But with regard to a sin that will eventually become known, it is considered to be like a case of one who has awareness of his sin at the end, and therefore only the goat whose blood presentation is performed outside the sanctuary in Yom Kippur itself atone for it. Or perhaps even with regard to a sin that will eventually become known, right now at least, before it becomes known, I can call it a sin of which only God is aware. And therefore the goats of the new moons and the festivals do atone for it. And the Gemara concludes, come in here a resolution of this dilemma, as it is taught in a Baraisa, for in a case in which one did not have awareness, neither at the beginning nor at the end, and it is a sin that will eventually become known, the goats of the festivals and the goats of the new moons do atone. This is the statement of Rabbi Yehuda. Now, the Mishnah taught, Rabbi Shimon says, the goats of the festivals atone for a case in which one never had awareness of his transgression, but the goats of the new moons do not. So rather, the latter atone for a ritually pure person who unwittingly partook of ritually impure for a ritually pure person who unwittingly partook of ritually impure sacrificial food. Not he was tameh, but the food was tameh. He didn't know that when he partook of it. Now the Gemara elaborates. So this is what we were talking about, the two cases that become four. So the Gemara elaborates. Rabbi Lazar says that Rabbi Oshaya says, what is the reasoning of Rabbi Shimon? The verse states, and he gave it to you to bear the sin of the congregation, Leviticus 10:17. And this verse is written with regard to the goat of the new moon, and its capacity to atone is derived from the tzitz, right? The tzitz is the front plate, the golden front plate that the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, wore in the holy temple, on which the words were engraved, holy to Hashem, holy to the Lord. And we know that the tzitz atones for sacrifices that are brought onto the altar and sacrificed there, burned there, even though there was something defective about them, like that they had become impure. The tzitz atones for that. Right? It atones for something different than what these goats atone for, but its capacity to atone provides the ruling and law that we're going to rely on. Right? And this verse is written with regard to the goat of the new moon, and its capacity to atone is derived from the tzitz through a verbal analogy between the words sin in this verse and the word sin stated with regard to the tzitz. The verse there states, and it shall be on Aaron's forehead, and Aaron will bear the sin of the sacred offerings. From Exodus 28:38. And the verbal analogy teaches like this. It is stated here with regard to the goat of the new moon, sin, and it is stated there with regard to the tzitz, sin. Just as there in the verse in Exodus about the tzitz, the atonement is for sin involving the ritual impurity, the tumah, of sacrificial meat, i.e. where such meat is placed on the altar, on the mizbeach. So too, here in the verse in Leviticus, the atonement is for a sin involving the tumah of sacrificial meat, i.e., where a ritually pure person partakes of meat that has become tameh. Right? So in one case, the altar consumes that sacrificial meat or that flesh from the sacrifice, and in the other case, a person consumes it. So this would be like a priest is permitted to eat part of a sin offering, right? Or an individual, the owner, is permitted to eat part of a peace offering. So the Gemara asks, if the two cases are to be compared, then one could take the comparison further. Just as there in the verse in Exodus, the atonement is only for meat that ascends upon the altar, so to here, the verse in Leviticus, the atonement is only for meat that ascends upon the altar. Maybe it has nothing to do with what people eat. So the Gemara rejects this suggestion. It is written with regard to the goat of the new moon to bear the sin of the congregation. This indicates that it atones for the personal sin of partaking, of eating sacrificial meat that was to be consumed by an individual, which had become tameh. The Gemara suggests, now the atonement of the goats of the new moon and that of the tzitz are derived from one another by a verbal analogy. If so, let the goat of the new moon atone for itself, i.e. for the cases that it normally atones for, and for that which the tzitz normally atones for, and the practical difference will be in a case where the tzitz was broken. And so the Gemara answers, let's read that again. If so, if we're saying that they're derived from one another, if we need these two verses to come as a pair, if so, let the goat of the new moon atone for itself, i.e. for the cases that it normally atones for, and for that which the tzitz normally atones for. Right? That the goats act, if they work together, so maybe the goats are actually atoning for sacrificial meat that went up on the altar. Maybe what the goats do is more extensive than we thought. And then how would we know that they're not doing that? So the practical difference will be in a case where the front plate was broken. So the Gemara answers, the verse states with regard to the goat of the new moon to bear the sin of the congregation, which indicates that it atones for only one sin, but it does not bear two sins. So if the tzitz was broken, then we would not have an atonement for sacrificial meat that went up on the altar and had become tameh. It would not be atoned for if the tzitz wasn't doing it. So the Gemara suggests, but let the tzitz atone for itself, i.e. for those cases that it normally atones for, and for that which the goats of the new moon normally atone for. Maybe it goes the other way, and the tzitz atones for more than what we thought it does. And the practical difference will be in a case of defiling the temple or its sacrificial foods that occurred between the goat offering of this new moon and that new moon which follows. And the Gemara answers, the verse states with regard to the goat of the new moon, and he gave it to you to bear the sin of the congregation, which indicates that it bears, i.e. it atones for that sin, but does not bear another sin. Rav Ashi states another proof for the opinion that each atones in a different case. It is stated here with regard to the goat of the new moon, the sin of the congregation, which indicates that it atones for the sin of the congregation, but not for the sin involving sacred offerings. And there, with regard to the tzitz, it is written the sin of the sacred offerings, which indicates that it atones for the sin involving sacred offerings, but not for the sin of the congregation. So the Gemara says, okay, we found a source for Rabbi Shimon's opinion about the goats of the new moons, that they atone for a ritually pure person, a person who's tahor, and who ate sacrificial foods that are tameh, that needs an atonement, and that's done by the goats of the new moons. From where do we derive his opinion about the goats of the festivals? That they atone for cases of defiling the temple or its sacrificial foods in which one did not have awareness neither at the beginning nor at the end. And the Gemara answers, it is derived, as Rabbi Chama, the son of Rabbi Hanina, says, in explanation of the opinion of Rabbi Meir. The fact that, with regard to the goat of the festivals, the verses that mention the goats could have simply stated a goat, but instead say and a goat, teaches that the goats of the festivals effect an atonement similar to that of the goat of the new moon that is mentioned at the beginning of that passage. And here too, the fact that the verse could have simply stated a goat, but instead says and a goat, teaches that the goats of the festivals effect an atonement similar to that of the goats of the new moon, which is mentioned at the beginning of that passage. Now we're on page 10a. And through this additional and, the goats of the festivals are juxtaposed with the goats of the new moons, indicating that just as the goats of the new moons atone for a case involving sacrificial food, i.e. were a ritually pure person, partook of ritually impure sacrificial food, so too the goats of the festivals atone for a similar case involving sacrificial food, i.e., where a ritually impure person partook of ritually pure sacrificial food. Right? We're saying that we're able to draw a connection, and that these are accomplishing the same thing. The additional goats of the new moon accomplish the same thing as the additional goats of the festivals. And if you would say, let the goats of the festivals atone for that which the goats of the new moon are sacrificed, that is not possible. Didn't we say above that the verse states with regard to the goats of the new moon, and he gave it to you to bear the sin of the congregation, which indicates that it bears, i.e. atones for that sin, but not for another sin. It sounds like the way it's worded is that they have a specific purpose, one that is not covered by another offering. But we just said that it is covered by another offering. So what's going on? And if you would say, let the goats of the festivals atone for that which the goat of Yom Kippur has brought, that is not possible. Didn't we say, the verse states with regard to the goats of Yom Kippur, Aaron shall bring atonement upon its corners once a year. And the emphasis on once a year teaches that this atonement is for this, teaches that this atonement for this case should be only once a year. So the Gemara explains, it must be that the goats of the festivals atone for cases of defiling of the temple or its sacrificial foods in which one did not have awareness, neither at the beginning nor at the end, because if not, for what other matter involving sacrificial foods could they atone? And if you would say that they atone for cases in which one had awareness at the beginning and had awareness at the end, then one can counter that he is liable to bring an offering. If you know you did it, that's where the sliding scale offering kicks in. And therefore, the goats of the festivals will not atone for him. And if you say they atone for cases in which one had awareness at the beginning but did not have awareness at the end, then one can counter that the goat whose blood presentation is performed inside the sanctuary and Yom Kippur itself suspend any punishment that he deserves until he becomes aware of his transgression. And if you say that they atone for cases in which one did not have awareness at the beginning but did have awareness at the end, then one can counter that the goat whose blood presentation is performed outside the sanctuary atones. Perforce, they atone only for cases in which one did not have awareness, neither at the beginning nor at the end. The Mishna teaches that Rabbi Meir says the atonement effected by all the goats offered as part of the additional offerings, i.e., those of the new moons and the festivals and Yom Kippur, is the same. Isn't that where we've been headed? They all atone for various cases of the defiling of the temple or its sacrificial foods. Rabbi Chama Bar Chanina said, what is the reasoning of Rabbi Meir? With regard to the goat of the festivals, the verse could have simply stated a goat, but it says and a goat, which teaches that all the goats are juxtaposed, this one with that one, as the use of the term and teaches that a second matter adds to the first matter. It's a great definition of the word and. The second matter adds to the first matter. And that all the goats effect a similar atonement as the first one listed, that of the new moon. The Gemara questions this interpretation. Initially, it enters your mind to explain that the atonement effected by each and every one of the goats of the festivals is derived from the atonement effected by the goat adjacent to it. The one mentioned in the passage immediately preceding it, the atonement effected by the Passover goat from the atonement effected by the goat of the new moon, and the atonement effected by the Shevuos goat from the atonement effected by the Passover goat, and so forth. But this is difficult. As doesn't Rabbi Yochanan say, with regard to the entire Torah, one derives a halacha derived via juxtaposition from a halacha derived via juxtaposition, except for halachas, laws, concerning consecrated matters, where one does not derive a halacha derived via juxtaposition from a halacha derived via a juxtaposition. And we're definitely talking about sacred matters here. The Gemara answers, La kasha, this is not difficult, because actually the atonement effected by all of the goats is derived directly from the atonement effected by the first goat, the goat of the new moon. The Gemara asks, Rabbi Chama bar Rabbi Chanina's explanation works out well for all the goats with regard to which it is written, and a goat. But from where do we derive that the goats of Shevuos and Yom Kippur atone for? From where do we derive what the goats of Shevuos and Yom Kippur atone for? As with regard to them, it is not written and a goat, but simply a goat. Right? They don't seem to be connected to the other verses because there's no and there. Rather, Rabbi Yonah says, the verse states at the beginning of the passage detailing the goats of the festivals, these shall you offer to the Lord on your festivals. With this verse, all the goats of the festivals are juxtaposed, this one with that one, which indicates that they all atone for the same sins, and the Gemara challenges. But the new moon is not a festival. Right? The new moon has a special status, but it's not a Chag, it's not Pesach, it's not Passover, it's not Shevuos, it's not Sukkot, it's Rosh Chodesh, it's its own thing. The Gemara refutes this. In truth, the new moon is called a festival. Right, a moed, right? So moadim l'simcha, like we say moadim l'simcha. So it is called a festival in accordance with what Abaye says with regard to a different issue. As Abaye says, with regard to the month of Tammuz in the year during which the Jewish people sinned by accepting the slanderous report of the spies about the land of Israel, the court made it a full month of 30 days. As it is written, right, they said, right, you have to hear testimony at the time of declaring whether a new month has begun or not, and it's either going to be 29 or 30 days when the new month begins. And so they made it a full month. A month of 30 days. As it is written, he proclaimed the festival to crush my young men in Lamentations 1:15. So Abaye understands the verse to mean that by extending the month of Tammuz by an extra day, by proclaiming that the 30th day should be celebrated as a new moon in addition to the first day of the following month, it emerged that the acceptance of the spies' report occurred on the 9th of Av. Right, this is the most tragic day in the calendar. And not on the 8th, thereby defining the 9th of Av as an ominous day for the Jewish people. And from Abaye's explanation, it is apparent that the new moon is also called a festival. The Gemara continues to analyze Rabbi Meir's opinion. Rabbi Yochanan says, and even though he holds that all the goats offered as part of the additional offerings affect atonement for the same sin, Rabbi Meir concedes with regard to the goat whose blood presentation is performed inside the sanctuary on Yom Kippur, that it does not atone their atonement, i.e., it does not atone for the sins that they atone for, and they do not atone for its atonement. In other words, Rabbi Meir would say the goat of Yom Kippur, right, which is tied to maybe all the sins of the Jewish people, isn't tied to these other atonements, which are more specific about sacred matters and defilement in the temple itself, which seems to be ascribed to the additional goats brought on the festivals and Rosh Chodesh. He elaborates. It does not atone their atonement, right? Yom Kippur is separate. It does not atone their atonement because, as the Gemara derived from the verse, Aaron shall bring atonement upon its corners once a year, Exodus 30:10, the goat, the internal goat, right? Meaning that the goat that's slaughtered by the Kohen Gadol and its blood is brought inside the sanctuary and even inside the Holy of Holies. The internal goat effects one atonement for only one case, but cannot effect two atonements for two different cases. And they do not atone its atonement because, as the Gemara explained, as the verse states, Aaron shall bring atonement upon its corners once a year. It's a unique goat. And the emphasis on the phrase once a year teaches that this atonement for the specific case that it atones for should be only once a year. And the Gemara adds, this qualification of Rabbi Meir's opinion is also indicated by that which is taught in the Baraisa. For cases of the defiling of the temple, in which one did not have awareness, neither at the beginning nor at the end, and for cases in which one did not have awareness at the beginning, but did have awareness at the end, and for a ritually pure person who partook of ritually impure sacrificial food, the goats of the festivals, and the goats of the new moons, and the goat whose blood presentation is performed outside the sanctuary, they all atone for that. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir. He's distinguishing the blood application on the altar outside the sanctuary from the blood application inside the sanctuary, even on Yom Kippur. Now the Gemara notes, but in delineating which offerings atone, Rabbi Meir omitted the goat whose blood presentation is performed inside the sanctuary. And furthermore, when delineating their atonement, i.e. what cases they atone for, he also omitted it, i.e. he did not mention the cases that the internal goat atones for, which are the cases in which one had awareness at the beginning but did not have awareness at the end. So evidently the atonement of the internal goat is substantively different from the atonement of the other goats. And so our proof has been undermined. The Mishnah teaches, Rabbi Shimon would say, The goat of the new moons atoned for a ritually pure person who unwittingly partook of ritually impure sacrificial food. And for defiling the temple or its sacrificial foods, the goats of the festivals atone for cases in which one did not have awareness, neither at the beginning nor at the end. And the goats of the additional offerings of Yom Kippur atone for cases in which one did not have awareness at the beginning, but did have awareness at the end. And the Gemara challenges, granted the goats of the new moons do not atone for that which the goats of the festivals atone, as the verse states, with regard to the goat of the new moon, and he gave it to you to bear the sin of the congregation, which indicates that it bears, i.e. atones for, one sin, but does not bear two sins. But nevertheless, let the goats of the festivals atone for that which the goats of the new moons atone. And the Gemara responds, the verse states, he gave it to you. The emphasis here is on it. He gave it to you. Teaches that it bears this sin, but no other offering bears this particular sin. And the Gemara challenges, granted the goats of the festivals do not atone for that which the goats of Yom Kippur atone, as the verse states with regard to the goat of Yom Kippur, Aaron shall bring atonement upon its corners once a year. And the emphasis on the phrase once a year teaches that this atonement, i.e. the specific case that it atones for, should be only once a year, but nevertheless, let the goats of Yom Kippur atone for that which the goats of the festivals atone. And the Gemara responds that the verse states once a year, which indicates that it affects one atonement for only one case, but cannot affect two. The Gemara challenges the use of these derivations, but when it states once a year, in this verse, it is with regard to the goat whose blood presentation is performed inside the sanctuary that this is written. So the derivations from it should have no bearing upon the discussion concerning the external goat. The once a year doesn't apply and limit both blood presentations inside the sanctuary and out. It's only referring to the inner one. So we could say that the outer one atones for the same cases that the goats of the new moon or the goats of the festivals atone for. And the Gemara answers this challenge by saying the verse states one goat for a sin offering aside from the sin offering of the atonements. One goat for a sin offering is referring to the external goat, and the sin offering of the atonement is referring to the internal goat. And with this verse, the external goat is juxtaposed with the internal goat, and therefore the limitations imposed on the atonement of the internal goat are also to be applied for the external goat. I'm a little confused. Okay, I freely admit. I think the language of the translation is a little confusing. There's not two different goats. We're talking about two different presentations of its blood, right? Because the two goats of Yom Kippur, one goes out to the desert, one has its blood used in two ways, internally and externally. Please somebody correct me if I'm wrong. That there's additional goats. I said that a few pages ago, but I don't think that we're saying that. I think that's the two goats, and one goat has its blood presented inside and outside. Okay, now we're on page 10b. The Mishna teaches, the Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda says in the name of Rabbi Shimon, a version of his opinion that differs from that of the Mishnah above. The goats of the new moons atone for a ritually pure person who unwittingly partook of ritually impure sacrificial food. And the goats of the festivals exceed them, as they atone both for a ritually pure person who partook of ritually impure sacrificial food and also atone for cases of defiling the temple or its sacrificial foods where one did not have awareness, neither at the beginning nor at the end. And the goats of Yom Kippur further exceed them, as they atone both for a ritually pure person who partook of ritually impure sacrificial food and for cases of defiling the temple or its sacrificial foods in which one did not have awareness, neither at the beginning nor at the end. And they also atone for cases in which one did not have awareness at the beginning but did have awareness at the end. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, get them in. So the Gemara asks, what is different about the goats of the new moons that they do not atone for that which the goats of the festivals atone? And the Gemara answers, and the verse states with regard to any one of the goats of the new moons, and he gave it to you to bear the sin of the congregation, which teaches that it bears, i.e. atones for one sin but not two sins, And the Gemara asks, if so, the goats of the festival should also not atone for that which the goats of the new moons atone, as the verse states. And he gave it to you, which indicates it bears one sin, but nothing else bears that sin. Why then does Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda cite Rabbi Shimon as holding that the goats of the festivals do atone for that which the goats of the new moons atone? Right? The problem we keep running into is that it seems like these goats serve the same purpose, and yet the language describing these goats describes them as serving a unique purpose. And they can't figure out, is it unique or is it, redundant? The Gemara answers, Rabbi Shimon does not learn anything from the word it. Accordingly, he holds that any one of the goats of the festivals can atone for two different sins. And the Gemara asks further, what is different about the goats of the festivals that they do not atone for that which the goats of Yom Kippur atone? As the verse states with regard to the goat of Yom Kippur once a year, which teaches that this atonement for the specific case that it atones for should be only once a year, and therefore no other offering can atone for it. And the Gemara challenges, if so, the goats of Yom Kippur should also not atone for that which the goats of the festivals atone, as it is written once a year, which teaches that the goats effect one atonement for only one case, but cannot affect two atonements. They don't apply to multiple cases. Why then does Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda cite Rabbi Shimon holding that the goats of Yom Kippur atone for everything that the goats of the festivals atone for? And the Gemara answers, Rabbi Shimon does not learn anything from the word once. He doesn't interpret it. Accordingly, he holds that the goats of Yom Kippur can atone for three different cases. And the Gemara asks, why doesn't he expound the word once? He does not expound it because when the word once is written, it is written with regard to the goat whose blood presentation is performed inside the sanctuary. And so the law derived from that verse has no bearing on the capacity of the goat whose blood presentation is performed outside the sanctuary to atone. And the Gemara asks, well, if so, the goats of the festival should also atone for that which the goats of Yom Kippur atone. As when the phrase once a year is written, it is written with regard to the goat whose blood presentation is performed inside. So the law derived from that verse has no bearing on whether the other offering can atone for that which the external goat atones. And the Gemara answers, actually, he does learn a halacha from the word once, and he holds that it also teaches about the capacity of the external goat to atone, as the Gemara explained above. But it is different here with regard to the derivation that the goat cannot effect two atonements, as the verse states, and Aaron shall bring atonement upon its corners once a year. And the emphasis on upon its corners, not so much once, but upon its corners, teaches that it is only with regard to the internal goat, whose blood presentation is performed upon the corners of the internal altar, that it affects one atonement for only one case, but cannot affect two atonements for two different cases. But the external application, the external goat, whose blood presentation is performed upon the corners of the external altar, can effect even two different atonements. Not easy, but well worth our desire to cleave to Hashem and join in and accept this invitation into the knowledge of Hashem. Okay. Yes, what I was talking about earlier, when you see something to criticize in other people, that this could apply to you, the Baal Shem Tov's mirror theory. He taught that when we look at others, we're looking at a mirror. When we observe and analyze the behavior of other people, we actually discover ourselves in them. And the profile we create for others is shaped by our own personality. Thank you for that, Nina. And on this point, Lionel says, we're particularly triggered by faults in other people that we share as well. My mom says hi from her 65th college reunion in Norton, Massachusetts, where she is this weekend. Just got a message from her. Please give my love to Phyllis. Yosef, when they say the goat atones for all sins, this is all types of sin that is unintentional. Right. Unwitting. Because when we talk about sacrificial offerings making an atonement, it has to be unwitting. Right? When something is done intentionally, I think there might be some exceptions, but generally for sure, when you do something intentionally, you need to atone for it. But a sin offering doesn't apply to that. Sin offerings are for an atonement for something that we did unwittingly. And Sharon says, Chad Gad Ya, right? So this is the goat that my father brought for Tuzuzim, the song that we sing at Passover. That's what I've got for us tonight. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, regular Sunday time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a terrific night and a great week.